The air in the makeshift field hospital was thick with the metallic scent of blood and the sterile bite of antiseptic. Outside, the sounds of war in North Africa were a constant, percussive reminder of the chaos from which these men had been pulled. For Oberleutnant Klaus Richter of the Afrika Korps, the world had been reduced to the throbbing agony in his leg and the coarse fabric of the stretcher beneath him. His mind, clouded by pain and morphine, was a maelstrom of ingrained certainties. He knew what came next. Capture was a prelude to humiliation, torture, and a final, ignominious death. Propaganda films had shown him what the Americans were, a mongrel race of gangsters and capitalists, devoid of honor, who would treat a defeated German officer with savage contempt. He braced himself, steeling his resolve for the inevitable brutality. He would not give them the satisfaction of hearing him scream. A figure in white approached, blocking the dim light. An American doctor. Richter tensed, his hand instinctively trying to reach for a sidearm that was no longer. Doctor, a man whose face was etched with exhaustion beside him. He didn't sneer. He simply looked at the shredded mess of Richter's thigh, his expression one of professional concern. He spoke in slow, careful English, the words gentle. "We need to get cleaned up. It's going to be all right, son." Richter stared, uncomprehending. This wasn't the snarling brute he expected. This was a healer. The doctor prepared a syringe. Richter's heart hammered against his ribs. This was it, the poison, the final indignity. He closed his eyes, reciting a silent prayer. He felt the prick of the needle, but not the searing pain of death. Instead, a wave of warmth spread through his veins, dulling the sharp edges of his agony. It was penicillin, a miracle drug he had only heard of in hushed whispers. He opened his eyes to see the doctor smiling faintly. "That should hold off the infection. We'll operate in the morning." This act of quiet, professional mercy was more disorienting than any physical blow. It was the first crack in the foundation of his entire worldview. He had been prepared for hatred, for cruelty, for a fight to the death. He was not prepared for kindness. To understand the depth of Klaus Richter's shock, one must first understand the world that had forged him. The Germany of the 1930s and early 40s was a nation sealed within an ideological fortress. Its walls were built by Joseph Goebbels, Ministry of Propaganda, and they were impenetrable. From childhood, every German was fed a steady, carefully curated diet of information designed to create a specific kind of soldier and citizen. They were told they were the Herrenfolk, the master race, destined to rule a continent. Their blood was pure, their culture was supreme, and their cause was righteous. Every victory was a testament to their inherent superiority, every setback a result of betrayal by lesser peoples. The enemy was not merely a political opponent. They were a caricature of evil, a racial and moral stain upon the world. The Soviets were portrayed as subhuman Bolshevik beasts, driven by animalistic fury. The British were arrogant, decaying imperialists clinging to a past glory. But the Americans were something else entirely. In the Nazi imagination, America was a nation without a soul. It was a chaotic melting pot of races, a mongrelized society obsessed with jazz music, gangster films, and the empty pursuit of money. Americans, the propaganda insisted, were not true warriors. They were soft, decadent, and undisciplined. Their army was a collection of factory workers and farm boys, conscripted against their will, who would break and run at the first sign of a real fight against the hardened, ideologically pure soldiers of the Reich. This wasn't just political rhetoric. It was presented as scientific fact, a biological certainty. Young men like Richter marinated in this ideology. They saw the newsreels of their panzers rolling through France, of the Luftwaffe dominating the skis. They believed in their own invincibility because they had never been given a reason not to. The concept of defeat was abstract, almost unthinkable. And the idea that these American degenerates could not only fight but also possess a moral code superior to their own. That was a fantasy, a lie as ludicrous as the idea of the sun rising in the west. The indoctrination went deeper than just newsreels and posters. It was woven into the very fabric of military life. The Wehrmacht, and especially elite units like the Waffen-SS, cultivated an ethos of ruthless efficiency. On the Eastern Front, the war was one of annihilation. Mercy was a weakness, compassion a fatal flaw. Soldiers were taught to view their enemies not as fellow men, but as obstacles to be removed, as ideological vermin to be exterminated. The Geneva Convention was a document mocked by their officers, a relic of a softer, more foolish time. They had seen the brutality meted out to Soviet prisoners, who were starved and worked to death by the hundreds of thousands. They had participated in a war where civilians were shown no quarter. This was the grim reality they knew, the only standard of conduct they had ever witnessed on a mass scale. They were conditioned to believe this was the natural state of total war. A soldier's duty was to his comrades and his fura. All others were expendable. This brutal mindset created a powerful, if terrifying, psychological projection. If this is how we, the superior race, treat our prisoners, they reasoned, how much worse will the treatment be when we fall into the hands of our inferiors? The fear of capture was immense, second only to the fear of death. Goebbels' propaganda machine preyed on this fear, circulating gruesome, often fabricated stories of captured German soldiers being tortured and mutilated by the Allies. The message was clear. Surrender is not an option. It is better to die in a blaze of glory for the fatherland than to suffer a fate worse than death at the hands of soulless enemies. This created a generation of soldiers who fought with a desperate, often fanatical ferocity. They fought not just for victory, but to avoid the horrific fate they were certain awaited them upon capture. When a German soldier was finally cornered, wounded, and out of ammunition, the world he expected to enter was one of pure, unrestrained sadism. He expected to be treated as he had been taught to treat others, like an animal. The idea of being treated with dignity, let alone professional medical care, simply did not exist within his realm of possibility. Beyond the battlefield, the civilian world these soldiers left behind was one of increasing deprivation. By 1943 and 1944, the German home front was beginning to crumble under the weight of Allied bombing and the immense strain of a multi-front war. The promises of a swift, glorious victory had evaporated, replaced by the grim reality of rationing, blackouts, and endless casualty lists. Letters from home were no longer filled with patriotic fervor, but with desperate accounts of survival. Food was scarce. A typical weekly ration for a German civilian was a meager portion of black bread, a few potatoes, a sliver of meat, and ersatz coffee made from roasted acorns. Luxuries like real butter, sugar, or fresh fruit were distant memories, available only to the highest echelons of the Nazi Party. The vibrant cities that had once hosted massive rallies were being systematically reduced to rubble. Night after night, the air raid sirens would wail, sending families scrambling into damp, crowded shelters, praying they would have a home to return to in the morning. The soldiers at the front knew this. They saw it in the pinched, worried faces of their families during their rare leaves. They read it between the lines of heavily censored letters. This reality of scarcity and destruction became their baseline for what a nation at war looked like. They assumed, logically, that their enemies must be suffering a similar, if not worse, fate. Nazi propaganda reinforced this belief, showing images of supposed breadlines in New York and striking workers in Detroit. The message was that the decadent American system was fragile, internally weak, and on the verge of collapse. The German soldier was told he was sacrificing for a cause, enduring hardships that his soft American counterpart could never withstand. He believed he was tougher, more resilient, and fighting for a nation that, despite its suffering, was morally and spiritually stronger. This conviction was a crucial pillar of his morale. The belief that everyone was suffering, that war had brought the entire world down to Germany's level of grim survival, was a comforting, equalizing thought. It was a belief that was about to be shattered in the most spectacular way imaginable. The journey itself was the first sign that something was profoundly wrong with their understanding of the world. After being processed in North Africa or Italy, the captured German soldiers were herded onto transport ships for the long voyage across the Atlantic. For most, it was the first time they had seen the ocean. They were packed into the holds of Liberty ships, vessels that were, in themselves, a source of quiet dread. The sheer number of them was unsettling. For every German U-boat that managed to sink one, it seemed 10 more appeared on the horizon. It was their first glimpse of an industrial equation that did not compute. On board, the surprises began to mount. They were not starved or beaten. Instead, they were given 3 meals a day. The food was simple, but it was plentiful. There was bread, not the coarse, dark rye they were used to, but soft, white bread. There was coffee with real sugar. There were portions of meat that would have been a feast for a civilian family back in Hamburg. They watched as the American sailors casually threw leftover food overboard, an act of waste so profound it left the hungry Germans speechless. It was a sin against the logic of scarcity they had lived with for years. They began to talk amongst themselves, their whispers a mixture of confusion and suspicion. Was this a trick? Were the Americans fattening them up for some unknown, sinister purpose? Perhaps for grueling slave labor. The indoctrination was strong, and it was easier to believe in a complex deception than a simple, unbelievable truth. As the ships neared the American coast, another shock awaited them. They saw no signs of war. There were no sunken ships littering the harbors, no bombed-out buildings marring the skyline of cities like New York or Norfolk. Instead, they saw a nation untouched, vibrant, and gleaming. The ports were bustling with an impossible level of activity. The sheer scale of it all was overwhelming. For men who came from a continent tearing itself apart, arriving in America was like landing on another planet. It was a world without ruins, a world overflowing with a casual, effortless abundance. The psychological walls built by years of propaganda were beginning to groan under the pressure of what their own eyes were seeing. They had been told they were laying siege to a fragile enemy. The evidence before them suggested the exact opposite. It was they who had come from a prison of scarcity and ruin, and they were just beginning to realize it. The train ride into the American heartland was a rolling panorama of disbelief. The prisoners were loaded onto passenger cars, not cattle trucks as they had expected. The seats were plush, the windows were clean, and the journey was smooth. This in itself was a jarring contrast to the grim, crowded, and often dangerous train journeys of wartime Europe. But it was what they saw through those windows that began to fundamentally unravel their perception of reality. The train rolled for hours, then for days, through a landscape that defied everything they knew about a nation engaged in total war. They saw endless fields of corn and wheat stretching to the horizon, all neatly cultivated and bursting with life. They saw vast herds of cattle grazing peacefully. There were no fallow fields, no signs of food shortages. This wasn't a country struggling to feed itself. It was a nation drowning in agricultural bounty. Then came the towns and cities. They passed through communities where life seemed to be proceeding with an unnerving normalcy. There were no blackouts, no rubble, no omnipresent sense of fear. At railroad crossings, they saw automobiles, not military vehicles but civilian cars, stopped in lines, waiting for the train to pass. There were so many of them. Back home, private car ownership was a rarity, and gasoline was more precious than gold. Here, it seemed every family had a vehicle. They saw children playing in lush green yards, housewives hanging laundry, men coming home from work. It was a portrait of a peaceful, prosperous domesticity that felt like a deliberate taunt. They saw factories, but these were not the bombed-out shells they were familiar with. These were colossal structures, humming with activity day and night, their parking lots filled with thousands of workers' cars. The sheer scale of America's industrial and agricultural base, viewed from the window of a comfortable train, was a silent, powerful argument against everything they had been taught. It wasn't a weapon they could fight or a slogan they could refute. It was just a simple, overwhelming, and undeniable fact. The war, which for them was a desperate, all-consuming struggle for national survival, seemed to be, for America, a distant project. A project the nation was handling with one arm tied behind its back, while the other arm went about the business of living, and living well. Upon arrival at the permanent POW camps, scattered across states like Texas, Arizona, and Mississippi, the cultural shocks intensified, becoming a daily assault on their senses. The first and most immediate was the food. It was an obsession, a constant topic of conversation, a source of endless amazement. The prisoners were issued daily rations that were, by German standards, ridiculously lavish. For breakfast, they might receive eggs, bacon, white bread with butter and jam, and coffee with milk and sugar. For lunch and dinner, there were generous portions of beef, pork, or chicken, accompanied by potatoes, fresh vegetables, and often dessert, a piece of cake, a scoop of ice cream. It was more and better food than most of them had eaten in years, including their time as active-duty soldiers in the Wehrmacht. They wrote letters home, trying to describe the unbelievable bounty, but the camp censors often redacted these passages, fearing they would be dismissed as unbelievable propaganda or would crush the morale of the starving families back in Germany. One particular item became a symbol of this incomprehensible American abundance: Coca-Cola. For a small fee earned by working on local farms or in camp workshops, prisoners could buy a bottle of the sweet, fizzy, dark liquid. For men raised in a culture of stoic austerity, this was the pinnacle of frivolous luxury. To have a special drink, consumed purely for pleasure, available in vast quantities in the middle of a war, was a concept so alien it bordered on the surreal. It was more than a beverage. It was a liquid symbol of a consumer society they couldn't begin to fathom. They saw their American guards, young men of their own age, casually drinking Coca-Cola on a hot day, as if it were water. It represented an entire universe of experience they had been denied. It spoke of a nation so wealthy, so productive, that it could afford to devote immense resources, sugar, glass, transportation, factories, to something that served no practical purpose in the war effort. It was a quiet but powerful testament to the fact that America was playing by a completely different set of rules. Operating on a level of material wealth that made the Reich's frantic efforts at resource management seem pathetic by comparison. The revelations were not confined to food and drink. The prisoners were often allowed access to camp canteens or post-exchanges, PX, where they could spend the script they earned. Walking into a PX for the first time was a bewildering experience. It was a treasure trove of goods that were either completely unavailable or strictly rationed to the point of non-existence back home. There were shelves stocked with cigarettes of multiple brands, sold by the carton. There were candy bars, Hershey's, Mars, Baby Ruth, each wrapped in colorful paper, promising a burst of sugar and chocolate that was the stuff of childhood dreams. They saw razor blades, shaving cream, toothpaste, and bars of soap, all in plentiful supply. They could buy magazines like Life and the Saturday Evening Post, their glossy pages filled with advertisements for cars, refrigerators, and radios, painting a picture of a consumer paradise that seemed more like science fiction than reality. These magazines became clandestine textbooks for understanding America. The prisoners would gather in small groups, poring over the articles and especially the ads. They saw images of smiling families in comfortable suburban homes, of gleaming new appliances that promised to eliminate household drudgery, of powerful automobiles that offered freedom and mobility. It was a vision of life so radically different from their own reality of air raid shelters and ration cards that it induced a kind of psychological vertigo. They learned that the average American factory worker, the very person their propaganda had dismissed as an oppressed wage slave, could aspire to own a house, a car, and a dazzling array of consumer goods. This was a level of prosperity that even mid-level Nazi party officials couldn't dream of. The cognitive dissonance was immense. They had been told they were fighting to protect their superior way of life from the decadent, failing system of American capitalism. But the evidence in their hands, in the form of a simple chocolate bar or a glossy magazine, told a different story. It suggested that it was the American system that was delivering a standard of living for the common man that their own vaunted National Socialism could only promise, but never provide. Among the most jarring and consistent shocks for the German POWs was the role and presence of American women. Their propaganda had painted a dualistic picture of foreign women. In the East, they were depicted as brutish, unfeminine laborers, while in the West, and particularly America, they were portrayed as frivolous, morally loose socialites obsessed with fashion and film stars. The reality they encountered utterly dismantled these stereotypes. On their train journeys, they saw women working in roles that were strictly the domain of men in Germany. They saw women driving trucks, operating farm equipment, and working on railroad crews. At the camps, they saw women in uniform, members of the Women's Army Corps, WAC, serving as clerks, drivers, and administrative staff, performing their duties with a confidence and professionalism that was both impressive and unsettling. When work details took them outside the camp fences to work on local farms or in factories, this exposure intensified. They saw the Rosie the Riveter phenomenon firsthand. Women were on the assembly lines, building the very machines of war that were crushing the Third Reich. They were welding, operating heavy machinery, and managing complex logistical tasks. They were not the delicate, decorative creatures of Nazi ideology, nor were they the downtrodden, masculinized figures of anti-Soviet propaganda. They were competent, strong, and seemingly empowered. The social interactions were just as confusing. They saw American women driving their own cars, going to shops, and speaking to men with a level of familiarity and equality that was unheard of in their own rigidly patriarchal society. The casual way American men and women interacted, the easygoing camaraderie between the sexes, stood in stark contrast to the formal, hierarchical social structures they were used to. For many German soldiers, who had been taught that a woman's place was strictly defined by kinder, Kuch, Kirch, children, kitchen, church, this was a profound cultural disruption. It suggested that American society was not weaker for this perceived blurring of gender roles, but perhaps stronger and more flexible. It was yet another piece of the puzzle that didn't fit, another pillar of their worldview that was beginning to crumble under the weight of direct observation. America wasn't just outproducing Germany, it was functioning on a completely different social operating system. The constant exposure to American media, particularly radio and newspapers, provided another layer of psychological disorientation. The camps were not information black holes. Prisoners were often allowed to listen to American radio broadcasts and read local newspapers, partly as a means of keeping them docile and partly as a soft propaganda tool. The effect was profound. They tuned into a world of incredible variety and, to their minds, shocking frivolity. They heard jazz and swing music, rhythms they had been told were degenerate and corrupting, yet the music was undeniably vibrant and full of life. They heard comedy shows, soap operas, and thrilling serial dramas, all interspersed with commercials enthusiastically selling everything from soap powder to automobiles. The sheer amount of airtime dedicated to entertainment and consumerism was baffling. How could a nation in a fight for its life be so preoccupied with such trivialities? The news broadcasts were even more jarring. They were delivered by commentators who were often openly critical of the Roosevelt administration, of military decisions, and of government policies. To the German soldiers, raised in a state where any criticism of the Führer or the party was a death sentence, this was incomprehensible. They witnessed a society that not only tolerated dissent, but seemed to treat it as a normal and healthy part of public life. They read newspaper articles detailing labor strikes, political debates, and scandals. The country appeared to be a chaotic mess of competing interests and loud, dissenting voices. According to everything they had been taught, such a nation should be weak, divided, and easy to conquer. Yet this same chaotic, undisciplined nation was simultaneously orchestrating the largest and most successful military-industrial operation in human history. This paradox was a source of endless debate in the barracks. How could a country so seemingly lacking in unity, discipline, and singular purpose be so powerful? The truth began to dawn on them slowly and painfully. The very things their own regime had identified as weaknesses, the freedom of speech, the consumer culture, the political infighting, were not weaknesses at all. They were symptoms of a robust, confident, and deeply resilient society, one so strong that it didn't need to enforce lockstep unity to achieve its goals. Nothing symbolized the technological and industrial gap more starkly than the constant, humbling presence of American air power. Even before capture on the battlefields of Europe and Africa, the drone of Allied bombers had become the soundtrack to their defeat. But in America, they saw the source of this power, and it was terrifying. From their camps in the vast, open spaces of the American South and Southwest, they had a clear view of the sky, and the sky was never empty. Day after day, they would watch as immense formations of B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators flew overhead, so many that they blotted out the sun. They flew in perfect, disciplined formations, not in the desperate, scattered groups of the dwindling Luftwaffe, but in armadas of hundreds, even thousands. These were not combat missions. They were training flights. Young American pilots, fresh out of flight school, honing their skills before being shipped overseas. The realization that this was merely the training wing of the U.S. Army Air Forces was a bone-chilling thought. If this was the number of planes and pilots they used just for practice, what was the full scale of their operational force? The prisoners, many of whom were veterans of the Luftwaffe or anti-aircraft crews, would watch in a state of professional awe and personal despair. They knew what it took to build a heavy bomber, the resources required, the man-hours, the advanced engineering. To see them produced on a scale that seemed as effortless as stamping out coins was to understand the true nature of the industrial beast they were fighting. They would count the planes until they lost count. They would listen to the endless roar of the engines until it was just a background hum. It was a constant, auditory and visual reminder of their own nation's limitations. Germany could produce brilliant engineers and courageous pilots, but it could not compete with this. This was not warfare as they knew it. It was a form of industrial annihilation, a war of mass production that rendered individual bravery and tactical genius almost irrelevant. The sky itself, once the domain of the triumphant Luftwaffe, now belonged to America, and its sheer, overwhelming dominance was a daily message to every prisoner. The war was already over. They just hadn't known it yet. The slow drip of revelations began to coalesce into a larger, more terrifying picture. It was one thing to be shocked by a piece of chocolate or a shiny new car in a magazine. It was another to begin to understand the system that produced them in such impossible quantities. Work details outside the camps provided the most visceral education in American industrial might. Prisoners were often contracted out as labor to local businesses, canneries, lumber mills, and especially farms, to help alleviate the wartime labor shortage. Here, they saw the engine of American abundance up close. On the farms, they were confronted with a level of mechanization that was light years ahead of German agriculture. They saw tractors, combines, and other sophisticated machinery that allowed a handful of men to cultivate vast tracts of land. A single American farmer could produce a crop yield that would require an entire village in Bavaria. This efficiency, multiplied across millions of farms, explained the endless fields they had seen from the train, the mountains of food they were served in the camp. It was a system built on technology and fossil fuels, not on the back-breaking human and animal labor that was still common in much of Europe. For the prisoners, it was a humbling lesson in logistics. They began to understand that an army's strength wasn't just in its tanks and guns, but in its ability to feed its soldiers and its people. Germany was starving its conquered territories to feed itself and was still falling short. America, by contrast, was feeding itself, its massive army, and a significant portion of the Allied world, seemingly without breaking a sweat. It was more than food. It was a symbol of everything they lacked. It was a symbol of a nation with seemingly limitless resources, a deep well of technological innovation, and an organizational capacity that dwarfed that of the Third Reich. The German war machine was a finely tuned, high-performance engine, but it was running on a finite tank of fuel. The American war machine was a colossal, unstoppable locomotive, powered by an entire continent. The prisoners could now see the source of its power, and it filled them with a sense of profound futility. While the soft power of Coca-Cola and Hollywood movies was disorienting, it was the hard power of the American military-industrial complex that truly broke the spirit of the German POWs. And at the heart of that revelation was the M4 Sherman tank. In their initial encounters in North Africa, German tankers, secure in their technologically superior panzers, had mocked the Sherman. They called them Ronsons, after the cigarette lighter, because of their tendency to catch fire when hit. Their own Tigers and Panthers, with their thick armor and powerful 88 guns, could destroy a Sherman from 1,000 yards away. This bred a sense of technological arrogance, a belief that German engineering would always triumph over American mass production. What they failed to comprehend, and what they learned in the POW camps through newsreels and conversations, was the sheer, mind-numbing logic of that mass production. A German Tiger tank was a masterpiece of engineering, but it was also a complex, over-engineered beast that took 300,000 man-hours to produce. The Ford River Rouge plant, by contrast, could roll a new, simpler, but still effective Sherman tank off the assembly line every 30 minutes. The German High Command might celebrate the destruction of 5 Shermans at the cost of 1 Tiger, feeling they had won the engagement. But the prisoners were beginning to understand the brutal arithmetic that their generals ignored. America would simply send 20 more the next day, and another 20 the day after that. They were not fighting a tank, they were fighting a factory that operated on a scale previously unimaginable in human history. They learned of the sprawling industrial giants, Chrysler, General Motors, Ford, that had completely retooled their operations from making cars to making machines of war. It was a horrifying realization. They had prided themselves on being the soldiers of a modern, industrialized nation, but they now understood that they were artisans fighting against an assembly line. Their individual skill, their superior equipment, their years of battlefield experience, all of it was being rendered obsolete by a flood of steel that could not be stopped. The war was not a contest of quality versus quality. It was a contest of quality versus quantity, and quantity had a quality all its own. The core promise of the title, The Shock of American Medical Care, deserves its own focused examination, for it was here that the psychological collapse often began. It was a moral shock as much as a technological one. For the wounded German soldier, like Oberleutnant Richter, the first encounter with an American field hospital was a journey into a different dimension of warfare. In the German military, medical resources were stretched perilously thin. A soldier with a grievous wound was often given a cursory treatment, and if he was lucky, a long, agonizing journey to an under-equipped hospital far behind the lines. Amputations were common. Infections were rampant. Drugs like morphine were precious and often reserved for those deemed most likely to survive and return to the fight. Now, as prisoners, they entered a system of an entirely different order. They were taken to clean, well-lit, and fully staffed hospitals. They were examined by doctors and nurses who treated their injuries with a calm, methodical professionalism that was utterly devoid of malice. The sheer amount of equipment was staggering. They saw X-ray machines that could pinpoint shrapnel with incredible accuracy. They were given blood transfusions from well-stocked blood banks, a luxury almost unheard of on the German side. And then there was penicillin. This was the true miracle. For soldiers who had seen countless comrades die from simple wound infections, penicillin was like magic. A single shot could halt the spread of gangrene, turning a certain death sentence into a recoverable injury. The Americans seemed to have an endless supply of it, and they administered it liberally to friend and foe alike. This was the part that broke their minds. Why would the Americans waste such a precious miracle drug on their enemies? Why would a highly trained surgeon spend hours meticulously reconstructing the shattered leg of a man who, just days before, had been trying to kill his countrymen? According to the Nazi worldview, this was not just illogical. It was a form of racial suicide. It was a sign of weakness, of a decadent morality that failed to distinguish between friend and enemy, superior and inferior. And yet this weak morality was saving their lives. The ethical dimension of the medical treatment was a constant source of disbelief and debate in the POW barracks. The Geneva Convention stipulated that prisoners of war should receive adequate medical care, but the Germans had come to view such international agreements as quaint suggestions, not binding laws. They had seen firsthand how the rules of war were systematically ignored on the Eastern Front. They fully expected their enemies to operate with the same ruthless pragmatism. Instead, they found themselves in a system governed by a rigid, almost sacred-seeming medical ethic. An American doctor's primary duty was not to the war effort, but to the patient in front of him, regardless of the uniform he wore. A story, repeated in various forms across many camps, illustrates the point. A German officer with a complex abdominal wound was brought to a field hospital at the same time as an American GI with a similar life-threatening injury. There was only one operating theater and one lead surgeon immediately available. The surgeon, following the unwritten but universally understood rules of triage, examined both men. He determined that the German officer's wound was more severe and that he was at greater risk of immediate death. Without hesitation, the American surgeon ordered the German prisoner into surgery first. The American GI had to wait. For the German soldiers who witnessed this, it was an act that defied all comprehension. It was a level of detached, principled humanitarianism that seemed almost alien. Their own officers would have laughed at the idea of prioritizing an enemy's life over one of their own. They would have called it treason. Here, it was simply called medicine. This experience did more to deconstruct the Nazi ideology than any propaganda lecture ever could. The Nazis had built their entire system on the idea of a racial hierarchy, of a world divided into the worthy and the unworthy. The American doctors, with their scalpels and their penicillin, were systematically dismantling that worldview, not with words but with actions. They were demonstrating a belief in the universal value of human life that the prisoners had been taught to despise as a weakness. And in that moment of vulnerability, lying on a hospital bed, they were forced to confront the terrifying possibility that this weakness was, in fact, a profound strength. As the prisoners recovered from their physical wounds, they began to observe the social dynamics of the world around them, and this led to another series of profound shocks related to the concept of democracy. The German military was a model of rigid, top-down hierarchy. An enlisted man would never question an officer. An officer would stand at attention and click his heels when addressing a superior. Orders were to be obeyed without question, and the social distance between ranks was vast and strictly enforced. The American Army, by contrast, appeared to them as a chaotic, almost unprofessional organization. They watched with amazement as young American privates would speak to their sergeants and even their lieutenants with a casual, almost familiar tone. They saw officers and enlisted men eating in the same mess halls, playing baseball together, and addressing each other with a startling lack of formality. They might hear a private call a lieutenant Lou instead of sir when off duty. To the Germans, this was a sign of a complete breakdown in discipline. How could an army function like this? They predicted that such a force would collapse in the face of a real battle. Yet this was the very army that had defeated them. It was another paradox that they struggled to resolve. They began to realize that the American Army's strength was not derived from blind obedience, but from a different source. A culture of shared purpose, individual initiative, and mutual respect that was a reflection of the nation's democratic ideals. An American soldier was encouraged to think for himself, to solve problems on the ground, to question an order if it seemed wrong. This fostered a flexibility and adaptability that the rigid German command structure often lacked. The relationship between the guards and the prisoners was another source of confusion. While there were certainly instances of hostility, many prisoners were surprised by the generally humane and often even friendly attitude of their captors. The guards were not indoctrinated fanatics. They were civilians in uniform, farmers, mechanics, and salesmen from Ohio or California. They did their job, but they often treated the prisoners not as subhuman enemies, but as fellow soldiers on the losing side of a war. This simple human decency was a constant, low-level assault on the Nazi propaganda that had painted Americans as hateful brutes. The concept of American democracy was not just an abstract idea. The prisoners saw it in action, often in the most mundane places. One such place was the camp library. Most POW camps had a collection of books and magazines, and the prisoners were free to read whatever they wanted. They discovered books by authors who were openly critical of capitalism, of American foreign policy, and even of the war itself. They found German literature that had been banned and burned by the Nazis, works by Thomas Mann, Erich Maria Remarque, and Albert Einstein. The very existence of these books in a military-run camp was a testament to a level of intellectual freedom that was unthinkable in the Third Reich. Elections held within the camps themselves were another powerful lesson. The American camp commanders often encouraged the prisoners to elect their own spokesmen and committees to handle internal affairs and liaise with the camp authorities. For many of the younger soldiers, who had grown up knowing only the Nazi system of appointed leaders, this was their first-ever experience with a democratic process. They held campaigns, they debated issues, they cast secret ballots. They learned to build consensus, to compromise, and to accept the results of an election, even if their preferred candidate lost. These small-scale exercises in self-governance were a revelation. They demonstrated that order could arise from the bottom up, through discussion and consent, rather than being imposed from the top down by force. It directly contradicted everything they had been taught about the supposed chaos of democracy and the necessity of a single, all-powerful Führer to maintain national unity. They began to see that the diversity of opinion they had mistaken for weakness was actually the source of the system's resilience. A society that allowed for constant debate and self-criticism was one that could identify its flaws and correct its course. The Third Reich, by contrast, was a monolith that could not bend and was therefore destined to break. This growing understanding of the practical strength of democracy was as devastating to their morale as the sight of 1,000 B-17s in the sky. The cumulative effect of these revelations was a slow, creeping sense of dread. The war was not being lost on the battlefields of Russia or France. It was being lost in the wheat fields of Kansas, in the factories of Detroit, and in the operating rooms of American field hospitals. The German prisoners were in a unique and terrible position. They were witnesses to the very truths their government was desperately trying to hide from its people and its soldiers. They were seeing the full, unvarnished power of their enemy, and it was crushing. Each new shock was another nail in the coffin of their former beliefs. The endless food demonstrated America's agricultural supremacy. The Coca-Cola and the candy bars showcased a consumer economy of impossible wealth. The powerful, confident women revealed a social dynamism they couldn't comprehend. The fleets of bombers and tanks were proof of an industrial capacity that defied logic. The professional, ethical medical care spoke of a moral foundation that shamed their own ideology, and the chaotic, vibrant democracy demonstrated a political resilience they had been trained to see as a fatal flaw. These were not individual, isolated facts. They were interconnected pieces of a single, overwhelming truth. Germany could not win this war. It was never going to win this war. The entire conflict was a suicidal gamble, a tragic delusion orchestrated by leaders who were either criminally ignorant of America's true strength or who simply did not care. For the prisoners, this realization was not a sudden epiphany, but a gradual, sickening process of acceptance. It stripped away their last reserves of hope and fighting spirit. How could they continue to believe in a cause that was so clearly doomed? How could they maintain faith in a Führer who had led them into such a catastrophic miscalculation? The enemy they were fighting was not the one from the propaganda posters. The real enemy was a system of agriculture, industry, and ideas that was simply bigger, richer, and, as they were beginning to suspect, fundamentally better than their own. They were not just prisoners of war, they were prisoners of a revelation, and the truth was its own kind of cage. The turning point for many prisoners was the moment when all the individual shocks, the food, the factories, the freedom, coalesced into a single, crushing understanding of scale. It was a transition from being surprised by individual trees to being terrified by the sheer size of the forest. This often happened during long conversations in the barracks at night, as men from different fronts and different backgrounds pieced together their experiences. A tanker who had been overwhelmed by Shermans in Normandy would talk to a Luftwaffe pilot who had been shot down by a swarm of Mustangs. A soldier from the Eastern Front, who knew the grim reality of a war of attrition, would listen to a former factory worker who now understood the principles of American mass production. They would take out their clandestine maps and copies of Life magazine, trying to make sense of it all. They would read about the American war bond drives, realizing that the nation was financing the war not through conquest and plunder, like the Reich, but through the voluntary contributions of its prosperous citizens. They read about the logistics of the Pacific War and were forced to confront the fact that America was fighting a second, equally massive war on the other side of the world, a conflict that Germany could not have sustained for a single month. The numbers they encountered were astronomical, beyond the scope of their imagination. They learned that the United States was producing more aircraft than all the other nations in the world, friend and foe, combined. They learned that Henry Kaiser's shipyards were launching new Liberty ships faster than German U-boats could sink them, sometimes building a massive cargo vessel from keel to launch in less than a week. This wasn't warfare. It was a statistical nightmare. It was a war of logistics and production schedules, and Germany was losing it on an abacus while America was winning it with a supercomputer. The emotional impact of this realization was devastating. It induced a feeling of profound smallness, of utter insignificance. Their own nation, which they had been taught was the pinnacle of human achievement, was revealed to be a second-rate power picking a fight with an economic and industrial giant. The courage of the German soldier, the genius of the German general, none of it mattered in the face of this avalanche of material. It was a deep, soul-crushing despair, the kind that comes from understanding with absolute certainty that you are not just on the losing side, but that your side was never even in the game. This intellectual collapse was often accompanied by a powerful emotional breakdown, a process the Americans sometimes called barbed wire disease. It was a state of deep depression and apathy born from the collision of past certainties and present realities. The prisoners would compare the vibrant, untouched American landscape with the Germany they remembered and the Germany they read about in letters from home. Their families wrote of huddling in cellars while terror flyers reduced their cities to moonscapes. They wrote of hunger, of cold, of the constant, gnawing fear. And then the prisoners would look out through the barbed wire at a guard driving by in his own car, on his way to a nearby town to see a movie and have a steak dinner. The contrast was too cruel, too vast to be endured. They saw American newspapers filled with trivialities, baseball scores, Hollywood gossip, advertisements for new refrigerators. It was a spectacle of a nation so secure, so utterly confident in its ultimate victory, that it could afford to be distracted. This casual normalcy was, in its own way, more terrifying than any display of military might. It signaled that America was not even fully mobilized, that it was fighting this colossal war with only a fraction of its total potential energy. What would it look like if it were truly desperate? The thought was too terrifying to contemplate. For many, the breaking point came from a simple object or a single image. It might be seeing a scrapyard piled high with discarded tires, each one representing more rubber than a German civilian would see in a decade. It might be watching a group of American teenagers on a picnic, laughing and sharing sandwiches, their lives utterly untouched by the horrors that had consumed their own youth. These small moments would trigger a sudden, overwhelming wave of grief and despair. It was the realization of a stolen youth, of a nation sacrificed for a lie. The bravado and arrogance that had characterized them upon capture evaporated, replaced by a quiet, brooding disillusionment. They stopped talking about glorious victories and started talking about how they had been deceived. The enemy was no longer the American guard outside the wire. It was the leadership back in Berlin that had led them to this hopeless end. The comparison between their own leaders and the ones they were now observing became a source of intense psychological conflict. They had been raised in the cult of the Führer, taught to see Adolf Hitler as an infallible, almost godlike figure who embodied the will and destiny of the German people. His speeches, broadcast into every home and workplace, were hypnotic, promising a 1,000-year Reich built on strength and racial purity. The entire state apparatus was designed to reinforce this image of unwavering strength and singular vision. The officers they served under emulated this model, often demanding absolute obedience through fear and intimidation. In America, they saw a completely different model of leadership. They read the speeches of President Franklin D. Roosevelt, which were often calm, reassuring, fireside chats that explained government policy in the language of a patient schoolteacher. They saw newsreels of him laughing, of him struggling with his leg braces, of him interacting with common people. He was not portrayed as a Superman, but as a fallible yet determined leader of a democracy. The most shocking discovery was the existence of a political opposition. They read newspaper editorials that fiercely criticized Roosevelt, calling him a warmonger, a socialist, or an incompetent administrator. They saw political cartoons that lampooned him mercilessly. In Germany, the author of such an editorial would have been arrested and sent to a concentration camp, his family along with him. Here, it was a protected form of speech, a routine part of the political landscape. This forced them to reconsider the nature of strength. Was strength embodied by a leader who silenced all dissent and ruled by decree? Or was it embodied by a system that was so robust and self-confident that it could not only tolerate, but actively encourage criticism of its own leader? The conclusion was inescapable. The Nazi system, for all its posturing about strength and hardness, was revealed to be incredibly brittle. It required absolute conformity because it was terrified of dissent. American democracy, for all its apparent chaos and division, was revealed to be profoundly strong, drawing its power from the consent and participation of its people, not their subjugation. The Führer they had worshipped now seemed like a fragile tyrant, ruling over a nation of prisoners, while the leader of their enemies was merely the temporary custodian of a power that resided with the people themselves. The industrial and psychological revelations were profoundly personal, but the final stage of their disillusionment would be a moral one, a confrontation with the ultimate nature of the regime they had served. This process was often slow, seeded by rumors and whispers that circulated through the camps. They had heard stories about the mass killings on the Eastern Front, about the special Einsatzgruppen units, but these were often dismissed as enemy propaganda or isolated excesses. The official narrative was that they were fighting a clean war, a necessary struggle to bring order to a chaotic continent. They clung to the idea that the Wehrmacht was an honorable fighting force, distinct from the more radical elements of the Nazi Party like the SS. The American authorities, as part of a deliberate re-education policy, began to gently introduce the truth. It started with showing uncensored newsreels. The prisoners would be assembled in a hall and shown footage from the war that had been sanitized by their own censors. They saw the full extent of the devastation of German cities, a reality that was far worse than what their letters from home had described. This was a shock, but it was a shock of scale, not of kind. They knew their cities were being bombed. Then the content of the newsreels shifted. They began to see footage from the newly liberated areas of France, Belgium, and Holland, showing the jubilation of the civilian populations. This contradicted the narrative that they were seen as liberators protecting Europe from Bolshevism. They saw images of starving children and destitute refugees, the human cost of their occupation. But the truly earth-shattering blow was yet to come. It would arrive with the liberation of the concentration camps in the spring of 1945. The initial reports were met with disbelief and denial. The stories were too monstrous, too far beyond the pale of human behavior to be credible. They had to be lies, the most vicious form of enemy propaganda designed to break their will to resist. They reassured each other that the truth would eventually come out and expose the fraud. They were tragically wrong. The truth was coming, and it was going to be far, far worse than anything the propagandists could have invented. In the spring of 1945, the American camp authorities made a fateful decision. They would force the German prisoners to confront the full, unvarnished reality of the Nazi regime. The time for denial was over. The prisoners were marched, often under protest, into makeshift movie theaters and forced to watch the first raw footage from the liberation of camps like Buchenwald, Dachau, and Bergen-Belsen. The grainy black and white film flickered to life, and the world of the prisoners was irrevocably shattered. There were no Hollywood actors, no dramatic music. There was only silence, punctuated by the voice of a grim, shaken narrator. On the screen, they saw things that the human mind was not built to process. They saw bulldozers pushing mountains of emaciated, skeletal corpses into mass graves. They saw the living skeletons, the Muselmänner, with their hollow eyes and shaved heads, staring blankly into the camera, their humanity stripped away by years of starvation and torture. They saw the ovens of the crematoria, the piles of human hair, the warehouses filled with thousands of pairs of shoes, from the boots of grown men to the tiny sandals of children. The reaction in the theaters was visceral. Men vomited. Some sobbed uncontrollably. Others sat in a state of catatonic shock, their faces pale, their eyes fixed on the screen in horrified disbelief. Hardened veterans who had witnessed the worst carnage of the Eastern Front were broken by these images. The violence of the battlefield was something they could understand, however brutal. This was different. This was not war. This was an industrial process of extermination, a cold, calculated, bureaucratic system of mass murder. This was the ultimate destination of the ideology they had been taught, the logical endpoint of dividing the world into a master race and subhumans. In that dark room, thousands of miles from home, the German soldier was finally forced to look into the abyss that his nation had created. The pride he once felt in his uniform turned to ash in his mouth. The oaths he had sworn to his Führer now felt like a curse. The war was no longer a tragic miscalculation. It was a monstrous crime against humanity, and they had been its instruments. The days and weeks following the screenings of the concentration camp footage were a period of profound psychological trauma and moral reckoning for the prisoners. The camps fell into a heavy, oppressive silence. The usual camaraderie and banter in the barracks disappeared, replaced by whispered conversations or solitary, brooding introspection. The men split into factions. A small, hardcore minority of devoted Nazis refused to believe what they had seen. They screamed that the films were fakes, elaborate hoaxes created by the Jews and the Americans. They clung to their ideology with the ferocious desperation of drowning men clinging to a piece of driftwood. But for the vast majority, denial was no longer possible. The evidence was too overwhelming, too visceral. They had seen it with their own eyes. For these men, the primary emotion was a deep and searing shame. It was a shame so profound that it corroded their very sense of self. They had thought of themselves as patriots, as honorable soldiers defending their homeland. Now they saw themselves as accessories to the greatest crime in history. They looked at their own hands and wondered what they had been complicit in. Every battle they had fought, every comrade they had lost, now seemed tainted by this ultimate horrific purpose. The question that haunted them was, how could we not have known? Some genuinely hadn't known the full extent of the genocide. But many were forced to admit to themselves that they had seen the signs. They had seen the roundups of Jews in their towns. They had heard the rumors. They had participated in a system that dehumanized entire populations. They had chosen not to ask questions, to look away, to focus on their duty as soldiers. They now understood that this willful ignorance was not an excuse. It was a form of collaboration. This moral collapse was the final and most devastating defeat. America had not just defeated their armies. It had exposed the moral bankruptcy of their entire cause. They had been conquered not only by tanks and planes, but by the truth. And for many, the road to recovery would not be a journey back to Germany, but a lifelong struggle to reconcile what they had been, what they had done, and the terrible knowledge of what their nation was truly capable of. The moral climax arrived not as a single explosive event, but as a slow, agonizing process of acceptance. After the shock of the concentration camp films, the prisoners were forced to reevaluate every aspect of their lives and beliefs. The contrast between the two worlds they had inhabited became stark and unbearable. On one hand, there was the world of the Third Reich, which had demanded their absolute loyalty, promising them glory and a place as masters of the world. It was a world of rigid hierarchy, brutal discipline, and a murderous ideology that had culminated in the factories of death at Auschwitz and Treblinka. On the other hand, there was the world they now inhabited, as prisoners of the United States. It was a world of bewildering abundance, of chaotic freedom, of casual kindness. It was a world where doctors used miracle drugs to save the lives of their enemies, simply because it was the right thing to do. It was a world that, for all its flaws, was built on a foundation of human dignity and individual worth. That was the polar opposite of Nazism. This was the final, devastating revelation. The people their propaganda had labeled as weak, decadent, and subhuman were the ones who had shown them a profound and consistent humanity. And the people they had been taught to revere as the pinnacle of civilization, their own leaders and ideologues, were the architects of an unimaginable barbarism. The moral compass of their entire world had been shattered and then reassembled, pointing in the opposite direction. The sense of superiority that had been drilled into them from childhood evaporated, replaced by a humbling, painful sense of inferiority. They were not the master race. They were the servants of a criminal regime. The realization was that the American strength did not ultimately come from its factories or its wealth. It came from its ideals. Flawed, imperfectly applied, often hypocritical, but ideals nonetheless. The belief that every person has a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness was not just a flowery phrase from a historical document. As they had witnessed in the hospitals and in the conduct of their guards, it was a principle that had shaped a culture. And that culture, that system of belief, had proven to be infinitely more powerful and resilient than the ideology of hate they had been willing to die for. In the aftermath of this moral collapse, the re-education programs run by the Americans took on a new significance. Initially, many prisoners had viewed these programs with suspicion, seeing them as just another form of propaganda. The classes on American history, the lectures on democratic principles, the screenings of pro-democracy films, all were seen as a clumsy attempt at brainwashing. But now, with their old belief system in ruins, the prisoners became hungry for new ideas, for a new way to understand the world. They began to participate in the discussions with genuine curiosity. They asked probing questions about the American Constitution, about the balance of power, about the rights of the individual. They debated the causes of the war, not from the perspective of Nazi propaganda, but from a new, more critical standpoint. For the first time, they were exposed to the idea that their own government had been the aggressor, that the war was not a defensive struggle, but a war of conquest and extermination. A key part of this process involved German Jewish intellectuals and political refugees who had fled the Nazis and were now living in America. These men would come to the camps and speak to the prisoners in their own language. They could explain the history of the Weimar Republic, the rise of Hitler, and the slow poisoning of German culture. This was incredibly powerful. It was not an American lecturing them. It was a fellow German explaining how their own country had gone so terribly wrong. The prisoners began to see that there was another Germany, a pre-Nazi Germany of poets, thinkers, and democrats that they had never been taught about. This was a critical step in their transformation. It allowed them to separate their national identity from the Nazi ideology. They could begin to imagine a future where they could be proud to be German again, but a new kind of German, a democratic German, committed to the ideals of peace and human rights. The seeds of post-war Germany's reconstruction were being planted, not in the halls of power in Berlin, but in the dusty barracks of POW camps in Texas and Alabama. As the war in Europe ended in May 1945, the atmosphere in the camps changed. The immediate tension of being on the losing side of an active conflict was gone, replaced by an uncertain future. The prisoners were no longer just soldiers. They were representatives of a defeated and disgraced nation. The process of denazification intensified. Prisoners were required to fill out detailed questionnaires about their involvement with the Nazi Party and its various organizations. They were interviewed by intelligence officers, who sorted them into categories: ardent Nazis, sympathizers, and those who had been conscripted without strong ideological conviction. The most fervent Nazis were segregated into special camps, where they would undergo more intensive re-education or await trial for war crimes. The rest were prepared for an eventual return to a country they could no longer recognize. During this period, many prisoners underwent a profound personal transformation. They had arrived as arrogant soldiers of the master race. They would leave as humbled men, burdened with a terrible knowledge. They had been given an education that no university could provide. They had seen the inner workings of two opposing world systems, and they had seen the results. Many of them developed a deep, albeit complex, respect for the United States. They did not necessarily love America, but they were in awe of its power and, in many cases, grateful for the humanity they had been shown. They had been captured expecting the worst, and had instead been treated with a decency that served as a constant rebuke to the cruelty of their own regime. One former Luftwaffe pilot famously wrote, "I came to America as a Nazi, and I am leaving as a Democrat." This sentiment was echoed by thousands. They had been defeated militarily, but the more significant transformation was ideological. They were sent back to Germany not just as former soldiers, but as unwilling missionaries for a new set of ideas, ideas that would be crucial in rebuilding their shattered homeland from the ashes of the Third Reich. The journey home was the reverse of the one that had brought them to America, but the men on board the ships were not the same. They were quieter, more reflective. They were sailing back to a continent in ruins, to a country occupied by its former enemies. They carried with them not just their meager personal belongings, but a heavy cargo of memories and revelations. They remembered the taste of white bread and real coffee. They remembered the sight of endless convoys of tanks and planes. They remembered the kindness of a doctor who saved a leg that should have been lost. And they remembered the horrific images from Buchenwald and Dachau. As they arrived in ports like Bremerhaven, they were confronted with the physical manifestation of their nation's defeat. The cities were vast landscapes of rubble, populated by a gaunt, shell-shocked people. The contrast with the vibrant, untouched America they had just left was almost too much to bear. It was one thing to see the destruction in newsreels. It was another to smell the dust and decay, to see the hunger and despair in the eyes of their own families. In the years that followed, these former prisoners of war played a unique and often unheralded role in the reconstruction of Germany. They became a powerful force against the resurgence of Nazism. When old comrades or unrepentant Nazis tried to claim that the concentration camps were a lie or that Germany had been unfairly defeated, these men could stand up and say, "No, I was there, I saw the films," And I was in America. I saw their factories. I saw their farms. We never had a chance. They could speak with an authority that no one could question. They had seen the truth with their own eyes. They became builders, politicians, teachers, and policemen in the new West Germany. They brought with them not just an intellectual understanding of democracy, but a visceral memory of the alternative. They had seen the power of a free society and the moral poison of a totalitarian one. They knew, in a way that those who had never left Germany could not, just how high the stakes were. The ultimate climax of this long journey of discovery was the internalization of a single, powerful idea. America was, in the end, undefeatable. This was not a conclusion born of fear, but of a sober, rational analysis of everything they had witnessed. They understood that Germany's defeat was not a matter of a few tactical errors or a particularly harsh winter in Russia. The defeat was preordained from the moment the United States entered the war, because the conflict was fundamentally asymmetrical. It was a war between a regional industrial power and a global economic superpower. The Third Reich, for all its military prowess and initial victories, was like a champion boxer who was strong and skillful but had a fatal flaw. He could not sustain a long fight. The American system, by contrast, was like a fighter who was perhaps slower to get into the ring, but who possessed seemingly limitless stamina and a punch that grew stronger with every round. They had seen that America's power was not just in its military. It was a holistic, systemic strength. It was in the fertility of its soil, the ingenuity of its engineers, the productivity of its workers, the flexibility of its democratic government, and most surprisingly, the fundamental decency of its people. This was a bitter pill to swallow for men who had been raised to believe in their own innate superiority. But it was also, in a strange way, a source of relief. It meant that the fault was not entirely their own as soldiers. They had not failed because they were cowardly or incompetent. They had failed because they were on the wrong side of history, fighting for a flawed ideology against a force of nature. This conviction, carried back to Germany in the minds of hundreds of thousands of former POWs, became a crucial psychological barrier against future military adventurism. It helped to cement the new, post-war German identity as a peaceful, democratic nation, firmly allied with the West. The greatest weapon America deployed in the Second World War was not the atomic bomb. It was the American way of life itself, and the German prisoners of war were the ones who had been subjected to its most powerful and transformative blast. The story of the German POWs in America is a story of transformation, a journey from arrogance to humility, from ideological certainty to a painful but necessary truth. These men were sent to fight a war for a system built on lies, and they were defeated by a system that, for all its imperfections, had truth on its side. When they returned to Germany, they carried this truth with them. They became a living antibody within the German population against the virus of Nazism. Their personal testimonies were more powerful than any official denazification program. They had seen the other side, and they knew the full, devastating context of their nation's folly. Consider the story of one former prisoner, a man named Werner. Before the war, he was an enthusiastic member of the Hitler Youth. He fought fiercely in France and was captured in 1944. In his POW camp in Arkansas, he worked on a farm alongside a German-speaking American family. They did not treat him as an enemy. They shared their meals with him, talked with him about their lives, and showed him a simple, everyday kindness that he found deeply unsettling. He saw that these mongrel Americans were hardworking, God-fearing people who valued their families and their freedom. He read American newspapers and learned about a world of ideas that had been forbidden to him. By the time he was repatriated in 1947, his entire worldview had been turned inside out. He returned to his ruined hometown, became a schoolteacher, and dedicated the rest of his life to teaching German children about the importance of democracy, tolerance, and international friendship. His story, and thousands like it, is the quiet, often overlooked legacy of the American POW program. It was a program that not only neutralized hundreds of thousands of enemy soldiers, but also, through a policy of humane treatment and exposure to the truth, transformed many of them into proponents of the very ideals they had once sought to destroy. It was a victory won not with bullets, but with bread, penicillin, and the undeniable evidence of a better way to live. The ripples of this experience spread far beyond the individuals who lived it. The letters the prisoners sent home, even when heavily censored, hinted at a reality that contradicted official propaganda. A son writing to his mother that he was being well fed and receiving good medical care was a small but significant crack in the wall of lies Goebbels had built. When these men returned, their stories spread through their communities. They told their families and friends about the scale of America, about the cars, the factories, and the food. These first-hand accounts helped to demystify the United States for a generation of Germans, replacing the caricature of propaganda with a more complex and awe-inspiring reality. This had a profound impact on the post-war relationship between the two nations. When the American Marshall Plan was initiated to rebuild Europe, the German population was far more receptive to American aid and influence because of the groundwork laid by the returning POWs. They knew that the American promises of help were credible because they had already experienced American generosity firsthand, even as enemies. The presence of hundreds of thousands of American soldiers stationed in West Germany during the Cold War was also viewed through a different lens. They were not seen simply as occupiers, but as the protectors of a democratic system that many Germans had come to value, partly because their own fathers, brothers, and sons had seen it in action across the ocean. The experience of the POWs helped to build a foundation of trust and even admiration that would turn a bitter enemy into one of America's closest and most reliable allies. It is a testament to the idea that sometimes the most powerful weapon in a nation's arsenal is its own example. By treating its defeated enemies with dignity and humanity, America achieved a lasting strategic victory that no battlefield triumph could ever have secured. It won not just the war, but the peace that followed. The resolution for the individual German soldier was often a quiet and personal one. For many, the return home was not a joyous occasion. They came back to broken families, destroyed homes, and a nation grappling with a legacy of immense guilt. They had to find a way to rebuild their lives in a world that no longer made sense. Many struggled with PTSD, not just from the horrors of combat, but from the psychological trauma of their complete ideological disillusionment. They had to reconcile the person they had been, the proud soldier of the Reich, with the person they had become. Yet in this struggle, many found a new sense of purpose. They had been given a rare and terrible gift, the gift of perspective. They knew, with a certainty forged in experience, that the path of nationalism, militarism, and racial hatred led only to ruin. This knowledge became their compass as they navigated the difficult post-war years. They were determined to build a new Germany that would never again repeat the mistakes of the past. They poured their energies into their work, their families, and the quiet, unglamorous task of building a stable, democratic society. The arrogance of their youth was gone, replaced by a sober and pragmatic commitment to peace. They did not often speak of their time as prisoners. It was a complex and often painful memory. But the lessons they learned in the heart of their enemy's homeland were woven into the very fabric of their renewed lives, and by extension, into the fabric of the new German nation. They had gone to America to conquer a continent and had instead been conquered by an idea of a world where strength was measured not by the ability to dominate others, but by the capacity for freedom, abundance, and compassion. It was the last and most important shock of their long journey. Looking back, the story of the German POWs in America serves as a powerful parable about the nature of power itself. The Third Reich represented one kind of power, the power of coercion, of centralized control, of a single unifying ideology enforced by terror. It was a power that was brittle, paranoid, and ultimately self-destructive. It demanded conformity and punished dissent, and in doing so it robbed itself of the resilience and creativity needed to survive a prolonged conflict. The United States, in contrast, represented a different, more diffuse kind of power. It was the power of production, of innovation, of a decentralized system that allowed for dissent and individual initiative. It was messy, chaotic, and often seemed inefficient. But beneath that surface chaos was a deep, underlying strength. It was the strength of a society that trusted its citizens, that valued their freedom, and that could harness their collective energy without extinguishing their individual spirits. The shock experienced by the German prisoners was the shock of discovering that the second form of power was infinitely superior to the first. They had been taught that strength came from unity and discipline, but they learned that true strength came from diversity and freedom. They had been taught that mercy was a weakness, but they learned that a principled humanity could be a devastating psychological weapon. The American doctors who treated them better than their own officers were not just healing their physical wounds. They were delivering the final, fatal blow to a dying ideology. They were demonstrating, in the most personal way possible, the moral and ethical superiority of the world the prisoners had been sent to destroy. In the end, it was this moral power, backed by an unstoppable industrial might, that ensured the Allied victory and reshaped the modern world. The central revelation for these men was not simply that America was strong, but why it was strong. They arrived believing in a worldview where power was a zero-sum game, taken by force and maintained through fear. Their own nation's economy was a war economy, its resources plundered from conquered lands, its labor supplied by enslaved peoples. It was a system that could only sustain itself through constant, violent expansion. What they discovered in the United States was a system that generated wealth and power from within. It was a positive-sum game, built on a foundation of vast natural resources, technological innovation, and a free market, consumer-driven economy. They saw a country that could produce both guns and butter, and not just butter, but Coca-Cola, Hollywood films, and a million other non-essential goods that spoke of a deep, almost decadent wellspring of prosperity. This was the source of the unending fleets of planes and tanks. It wasn't the result of a totalitarian state whipping its people into a frenzy of production. It was the almost casual byproduct of a free, dynamic economic system that had temporarily shifted its focus to war. The prisoners realized that America wasn't just another country. It was a continental system, self-contained and self-sufficient, operating on a scale that made the European powers look like petty fiefdoms by comparison. This was the ultimate strategic advantage, one that no amount of German tactical brilliance or fighting spirit could ever hope to overcome. They had been sent to fight a war against an army, but they found themselves fighting a war against an entire economic model, and it was a battle they were destined to lose before the first shot was even fired. This understanding, carried home by the POWs, helped shape the post-war European consensus that the future lay not in conquest, but in economic cooperation and integration, a lesson learned the hard way in the prison camps of their victorious enemy. In the final analysis, the story that began with a single act of kindness, a doctor treating a wounded enemy, broadens into a profound statement on the clash of civilizations. The shock of the German POWs was the shock of a closed society encountering an open one. It was the collision of an ideology of scarcity and racial purity with a culture of abundance and diversity. The Third Reich taught its soldiers that they were superior, that their enemies were weak and degenerate. But every moment of their captivity provided evidence to the contrary. They were treated with a professionalism and humanity that exposed the barbarism of their own system. They were confronted with a level of industrial and agricultural might that revealed the fragility of their own war machine. They witnessed a level of personal freedom and prosperity that made a mockery of their supposed workers' paradise. The simple act of a doctor choosing to save an enemy's life was a microcosm of this larger conflict. It was an act rooted in an ideology that held human life to be universally valuable, an ideology directly opposed to the Nazi creed of a racial hierarchy. It was not an act of weakness, as their training would have suggested, but an expression of a deep, civilizational confidence. It was the quiet assertion of a society that was so sure of its own moral and material strength that it could afford to be magnanimous even to those who sought its destruction. This was the war's most enduring lesson, delivered not in a hail of bullets, but in a shot of penicillin and a cup of coffee. It was the quiet, devastating realization that they had been fighting on the wrong side of not just the war, but of humanity itself. The tale of these prisoners is a timeless reminder that wars are fought and won not only on battlefields, but in the minds of men. It is a story of how an enemy's entire reality was deconstructed, piece by piece, not by force, but by overwhelming evidence. The German soldiers arrived in America as true believers in a powerful and seductive ideology. They left as men who had been forced to confront the lies at its core. They had been prepared for a fight against soldiers, but they were instead met with a system that defeated them with its sheer, undeniable success. From the shocking professionalism of American doctors to the mind-numbing output of Detroit's factories, every experience was a lesson in the true nature of national power. It was a power derived not from conquest, but from creation, not from enforced conformity, but from chaotic freedom, not from racial hatred, but from a fundamental, if imperfect, belief in the dignity of the individual. The greatest shock for these German prisoners of war was the discovery that the weak and decadent democracy they had been sent to destroy was, in fact, the most powerful human organizing principle the world had ever seen. Their defeat was total, militarily, industrially, and finally, morally. And in that defeat, they carried back to their ruined homeland the seeds of its rebirth, a testament to the fact that sometimes The most effective way to change an enemy's mind is not to break his body, but to simply show him a better world. For more untold stories from the Second World War and beyond, be sure to subscribe to our channel.